This is Johnny Dosco. Stay tuned for another Scoresheet podcast. Holy Kadelka!
Hello, and welcome to another Scoresheet podcast. Today, actually, I don't have a guest other than myself talking to myself. I wanted to talk a little bit about football. I'm recording this, as I am. It's week 15 of the 2013 season. I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of season-ending thoughts and maybe what you want to think about for next year before you kind of put this season to bed. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about the wild card game that was played week 14. As I think anyone knows that played football this year with us. This year, for the first time, we decided to use week 14 both for the last week of the regular season and also for the wild card game. The reason we did that was that last year when we did a couple surveys, folks told us they did not want us to use week 17 any longer for the Scoresheet championship game due to too many NFL players sitting out that week. But they also wanted to keep 5 playoff teams, and they also wanted to keep 14 full weeks of the regular season. So to do all 3 of those was kind of tough. We only used 16 weeks of the season, but we still had 5 teams. We needed 3 rounds of playoffs, and if we didn't want to cut a week out of the regular season, we had to keep the regular season going through week 14. So we decided to play the regular season week 14 games and then play the wild card game. We will be sending out another survey to see what people thought of that, since we've only done it this year. We could go back to using week 17. We could go to 4 playoff teams. We could do what we did this year, but we'll do whatever the majority of folks want us to do based on that survey. The other thing about football, I think, in general, so I was kind of looking over my leagues. I really think that when you're preparing for next year, you need to maybe think of football as somewhat different than other fantasy sports. And baseball, basketball, hockey. I think the thing that makes football different is that depth is so much more important. There's just a lot of injuries. There's also a lot of players that underperform expectations that you might draft kind of high. I know on my teams this year, I had Trent Richardson on multiple teams. As you can imagine, that didn't work out very well. Also had Aaron Rodgers on a couple teams, and that was working great till he got hurt. But there's a lot of backups out there that actually put together pretty good years. And so I think you need depth. Unlike other sports, it's not always true in football that trading 4 kind of average players for 1 really good player is a good idea. I think in baseball that sometimes works really well. But in football, if you don't have some depth, you're really susceptible to injuries or bad performances. I also think in football that along with that, it's much more important what you do during the season than it is in other sports, both in choosing your weekly lineup, who to start, and also in making either trades or free agent moves. You know, picking up a guy like Josh McCown or maybe trading for Nick Foles or getting him late in the draft can really offset the fact that Aaron Rodgers got hurt. Or if you pick up some running backs that maybe went later in the draft or were even available as free agents, you can get away from Trent Richardson kind of killing your team. I really think the preseason draft in football, while of course it's important, it's just not nearly as important as in the other sports. I think in baseball, if you don't draft good talent, it's pretty tough. In football, you can lose your first round pick or your second round pick or even both and still compete if you made some good picks later on. Nick Foles, he didn't go high in any drafts. He was the backup for Michael Vick, and I think in some leagues, he might have even remained undrafted. Certainly Josh McCown was undrafted in most leagues. But Nick Foles obviously turned out to be very valuable. Or Keenan Allen or Josh Gordon went late in a lot of leagues, or was certainly available for trade. I think that even if those guys were drafted, if you wanted to trade for them the second week of the season, you would not have had to give up very much at all. So I think in football, more so than other sports, you can't just draft a team and then kind of put it on autopilot, maybe just changing your lineup. The other thing is lineups in football are just more important than any other sport. I think that because there's only 1 game a week, players perform so differently from week to week. You really need to do some careful consideration. I'm not saying it's a matter of luck. I think there's a lot of skill involved in making out a lineup. But, you know, if your running back is going against Seattle, that's a lot different than if your running back is going against Chicago or Dallas. I mean, Dallas, you almost got to the point it seemed like this year where no matter who you had in your team, if they were facing Dallas, you wanted to put them in your starting lineup if they were an offensive player. So I think You need to really not only make a lineup every week, but you need to put some thought into it if you want to take advantage of your players. Because the matchups, teams' defenses change quite a bit from year to year. You can't just say, oh, they were good last year, they'll be good this year. Another thing I did wrong, other than drafting Trent Richardson in too many leagues, is I looked at my team. I didn't really take into account how much, say, a quarterback like Peyton Manning might affect the value of his receivers. Obviously, we all know that a little bit, but I ended up with 0 Denver offensive players on my teams. And in hindsight, that was obviously a huge mistake. The running backs were a little tough because Denver's kind of notorious for not just settling on one guy. But the receivers, it might have been hard to know when to play Eric Decker because he didn't have great games every week, but he would have helped. And Demaryius Thomas would have helped my team. A lot of people. So I think maybe thinking about who's a quarterback when you're going to draft a wide receiver, or if a team's offensive line has greatly changed over the course of the offseason, that will affect how a running back will do. These are all kind of things you might even think about a little bit now while the season's fresh in your mind rather than trying to remember in July. Injuries are also a huge thing. If a guy had lousy numbers, because he was hobbled all year, and if he just plain didn't play, that's pretty easy to see next August. You can just see, oh, he didn't have any playing time. But sometimes there's guys who play in almost all 16 games. They just don't perform very well. And you might make a note this time of year that, oh, I remember that so-and-so kind of had a sprained ankle all year, and maybe he'd be a great bounce-back candidate next year. So I think in general, if your year didn't go as well as you were hoping it would, doing just a slight bit of maybe note-taking now when the season's fresh in your mind will really help your team next year. And once again, we'd love some feedback about the wild card thing. We'll send out a survey, but you don't have to wait for that. If you played Scoresheet football this year and you want to email us your thoughts about the wild card game or what you'd like to see as a playoff setup next year, that would be great. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks. I hope you all have a great holiday season. Merry Christmas.